Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this panel session. Hope everyone's enjoying the conference so far. It seems strange to me that we're actually nearly at the end, but I've certainly enjoyed it immensely. We're going to talk about evaluation's role in delivering Sustainable Development Goal 7. Particularly what evidence and analysis is needed to provide universal access to sustainable energy. So just as a reminder, SDG7 is about ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. So it's a big ask, and evaluation's role in that is going to be crucial, I think. So we've got 3 speakers this morning. And we're going to address the 3 questions you can see on the screen. We're going to start off with what role does evaluation play in your work, and does it help you to be more effective? If so, how? And then we're going to talk about what else they'd like to get from evaluation, what difference would that make? And then thirdly, how can we do evaluation better? What are the key actions for funders and evaluators? What can energy evaluation do? Now, we're really keen to get your opinions, thoughts, ideas, and questions. So please do put all of those in the Q&A box. It doesn't matter if it's not a question. It can be a thought or a comment or an objection or whatever. But please do put stuff in there. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and I will bring those in as appropriate. So it's not going to be like a standard session where people talk a lot and then we have questions at the end. We're going to take questions as we go through after each question. And as I say, welcome views and opinions and ideas, as well as sort of more formal questions. So I think everyone knows by now that you don't use the raise hand facility because it doesn't make any difference. And I won't necessarily be keeping an eye on the discussion forum. So as I say, if you want things to get on air, then put them in the Q&A box. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to the presenters. Each of them is going to introduce themselves and then address the first question. And we'll start off with Brian Dean. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. So hello, everyone. So I'm Brian Dean. I'm Head of Energy Efficiency at Sustainable Energy for All. And SE for All was created as a custodian organization to really help drive SDG7 and achieving the goals of SDG7 on energy access, on renewable energy, and energy efficiency, SDGs 7.1, 2, and 3. And data and evaluation, data and evidence that comes through evaluation is really critical, not just our work program, but to achieving SDG 7. Here we see that we're in the final decade until 2030 to achieve SDG 7, and we're really looking to make sure that impact occurs. Of course, for us to achieve that impact, there's a whole series of efforts. Some of our key programs include energy planning. Well, you can't do energy planning without good data evaluation that says what the impact of certain measures are, the impact of certain policies, information and evidence on the effectiveness of policies. You need evaluation to understand whether or not it's actually going to be able to enable private investment. And then, of course, that investment, you need evaluation to understand what investment is happening and whether it's effective. And our Energizing Finance series digs into that quite a lot. But also, we have a series of projects on energy efficiency, access to cooling, clean cooking, electrification. All of these, they do need data and evidence to really understand, one, why do we need energy? And 2, what services can that energy provide? I think, evaluation is really critical for us. Certainly we try to use it internally. We have a MEL team that supports evaluating our programs internally and looking at theories of change. But certainly evaluators like all of you are critical to supporting this SDG7 effort as well. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Charles.
Thanks, Brian. And I will give it straight back to Richa Goyal, who is from the Energy Saving Trust. Over to you, Richa.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Richa Goyal. I co-lead research at an FCDO and IKEA Foundation funded program called Low Energy Inclusive Appliances Program. And the objective of this program is to increase access to off-grid appropriate, efficient, and affordable appliances in Africa and South Asia. I also serve as a senior insight manager at Energy Saving Trust. And so at the layup program, something I'm trying to do is to bring to light a variety of different impacts that we should be concerned about rather than the most obvious types of impacts that we have previously focused on investigating. As an example, within the realms of environmental impacts of energy access interventions, dirty fuel replacement and energy efficiency are two of the most commonly explored types of impacts for very, very right reasons, and the focus needs to be here. However, given the increasing urgency of climate change, there are many other types of positive environmental impacts that we can create and that are worth investigating in the energy access work. So to give a quick example, a recent WEF report estimates that carbon emissions from production and use of electronics will reach about 14% of total global emissions, which is 1/2 of total emissions from global transport sector, which is huge. And so we should also be looking at strategies to bring about resource efficiencies and reducing material requirements in the production and use of off-grid energy access technologies. And the second thing is that appliance ownership of off-grid households is quite low. For instance, in African households, about 4% African households own a refrigerator and 18% or 16% own a television if you don't include South Africa. And so because energy access programs enjoy a unique leverage to influence the type of off-grid technologies that get developed and deployed, there's a unique opportunity to directly leapfrog these populations to appliances that are not just efficient and affordable, but are also circular or low carbon and inclusively designed, so they're usable by all genders and accessible to people with disabilities. So these are some of the types of impacts that I'm exploring via projects. And finally, I should also mention the impact assessment project, something I'm project managing, where we're creating a standardized list of impact metrics across key appliance categories that the industry could adopt and report against in a harmonized way. And this speaks to the upward accounting that Brian just spoke of measuring effectiveness of funding and incentivizing funding, because then each organization or company doesn't have to invest resources in creating its own list of impact metrics. So this is just a little bit about the role of impact in my work. Back to you, Charles.
Jeremy Tait. Jeremy, please introduce yourself and address the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. I'm a technical support to policymakers. Basically, I work independently, helping policymakers and program managers to devise and implement their programs and policies. I work independently on product policy. It's been my main focus through my career, and I work with Efficiency for Access and the Layup program that Richa has just described, as well as some work for the African Union Commission. And but it's all basically been about appliances, and in the last 2 or 3 years I've got much more involved in the off-grid space, having spent most of my time with grid-connected appliances. So having worked with energy labeling and eco-design, that's a pretty well and much evaluated policy area. And I've worked with evaluation results. I've tried on occasions a bit of evaluation myself, but I'm certainly not an evaluator. I'm a user of evaluations, and I think they are incredibly useful in forcing you to think about what's actually been achieved. And it goes much more than just a warm glow or something that's useful to secure further program activities. But I really welcome the fresh eyes on what has been done. And I think one of the some of the most interesting results come out of the discussions that the evaluators are having with beneficiaries and hearing what the views of the beneficiaries are of what's happened. And I think the independent thinking of the evaluator is crucial, and it must focus on the outcomes, not just on the outputs. And when we hear about the SDG7 challenge, it's easy to focus on the number of connections as being, as being a useful indicator of the size of the challenge. But it's not about electricity, it's about services. It's about what services can be achieved from those connections. So in the same way that when you're looking at tree planting, you have to look at the conditions for making thriving trees, not the number of seedlings that are pushed into the ground. So yeah, I'd really like to explore in this session maybe some of the things that put the focus on the conditions and the outputs, the outcomes that are needed from the evaluation. And it's dealing with some quite complicated issues, and there's a couple of those I'd like to talk about in this session. So, thank you.
That's quite a tease, Jeremy. Okay, so we're going to talk about some complicated issues, but not quite yet. But there were a couple of things that I'd just like to explore in what you've said so far, and yeah, please do add things in. People feel free to add things into the Q&A, which is empty at the moment. So get your question in now, and it'll get asked first, or your comment in now. But one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking was you were all talking very much about impact and less so about the sort of course correction, adaptive management type of purpose for evaluation. And I don't know if that's because of the sort of nature of the things you're involved in, or something specific to do with the sort of SDG7 world, or just it didn't occur to you to mention it. Maybe sort of get you to reflect on that for a moment.
If I might just butt in quickly first.
Please do.
I think you've hit on a very important point there, because one of the things that is of sort of pressing on my mind now is the sheer urgency of what needs to be done here. And we have to be focused on course corrections, because we can't finish a program and sit back and think about it for a year. We really have to be doing live to the programs to make sure that they're working well. And I think, Charlie, you made a very good point there in terms of it needs to be course correction focused as it's happening, really, just because of the urgency of the challenge.
Brian and Richard, do you have a view on that? I guess as sort of managing things, it's different from the view of Jeremy and I as sort of kind of outsiders in this. Go on, Brian.
Yeah, certainly from our side at SE for All. I mean, we actually, with our new CEO that joined last year, we've gone through a new business plan process. That's really all about course correction and working towards, delivering that impact. But it doesn't stop there, of course. We continue to have conversations about our theory of change and, what our KPIs are, and, continually working with our funders to understand what indicators are most important for them, what activities and outputs and outcomes are critical. That said, of course, we are going through the process now of doing a in-program evaluation of our Cooling for All program, and that is really exactly about what you said, Charles. It's about looking at the impact that we have had over the last 4 years, but really looking forward and making sure that we can continue to course correct, even though we've been working on that all year, or for the last year. But certainly evaluation with that process that we're going to be starting soon is all about course correction.
Right. Interesting. Just want to bring in a question from the audience, from Gavin, Gavin Killett, who wants to ask about the relationship of the Valuator to the commissioning client and beneficiaries. do you see the evaluator as just a conduit for information, so kind of capturing information from the beneficiaries that then they can bring to you as the commissioning client, and you can then pass on to funders in that sort of way, or is the evaluator, should the evaluator be adding more to that? Who'd like to go first?
Should I go?
Please do, Richa. Yeah.
So I think it depends on the context a little bit, and also, unfortunately, depends the circumstance of the evaluator in terms of funding and budget and programmatic effort. But I think the evaluator has role to both. I mentioned upward accounting during my introduction, which is that you need to demonstrate to your donors and investors that the money that they've pumped in a certain intervention is resulting in impact. And so a lot of the impact evaluations may tend to be guided by the types of impact categories those types of stakeholders might be interested in. But there is also a downward accounting responsibility of an evaluator, which is to be honest and try and measure the real types of impact that the beneficiary is experiencing. And if you are able to create a good impact project that very clearly demonstrates the types of impacts that may occur because either an intervention is poorly designed or an intervention is positively designed, so leading to positive impacts, then you are also able to attract funding towards those types of impacts and interventions going forward. So yeah, a little bit depends on your circumstance.
And from my side, I see an evaluator as having a different way of thinking and having different methods. I would say that my team, we would have the data and the information, but the evaluator brings in that critical way of thinking and the methods that our team doesn't have. So that's where I see evaluator really adding a lot of value to better understanding the impacts that we're making, the opportunities that we have to deliver more impact moving forward.
That's interesting. So definitely looking for the added value. Sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
Just thinking that your question, Charles, that you posed was about whether it's the evaluator should be a conduit for information. It made me think of an analogy that I heard apparently from just the way Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of the Ministry for the Future, was talking about his role as an author for, and the analogy he said that he sees his role as like a telephone operator, where you have many connections you could make in this role, but it's the crucial, getting this job right is connecting the right people, the right views through to the beneficiary, the report, I suppose, in terms of the evaluator. So that there's a role of research and selecting these inputs and bringing the most useful ones to the center, and then there's some synthesis on that as well. But it's having that making those broad connections in the right way to add value to the decisions that can be made.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. Richa, I'll come back to you in just 1 second. I think one of the things that it seems to me is that sometimes evaluation is seen as a sort of judgment-free exercise, which is simply so kind of pursuing evidence and presenting it. Whereas actually, I think we should recognise that evaluators make judgments all the time as they're going through their work. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why it's really important that evaluators really understand what the purpose of the evaluation is, who needs what from it, so that they can use that skill to support that. That purpose of strong dialogue across that process. Richard, you come back in, yes.
Thanks, Charles. I just wanted to unpack that whole point that you just concluded, and Brian was mentioning earlier, that often in terms of methods, often it can also be quite challenging for the evaluator, because to determine what the right method of investigation needs to be requires sometimes a multi-skill set, because one evaluator could be a GIS specialist, one evaluator could be an econometric specialist, one could be an AI specialist, and one could be a great at field work. So, and often it is very hard for one individual to have all the skill sets. So there is also a role for interdisciplinary teams where it's possible to bring different disciplines in. And also just wanted to say that every method has a place in evaluation. Oftentimes some people tend to say that this method is superior or is not. So that's the good point that Brian was making, that one really key role of the evaluator is to be able to determine the right method that is most cost efficient, but also most impactful for that particular research question.
Yeah, and yeah, very, very good point that we will all tend to propose the methods we know and are comfortable with, rather than the ones we don't. So, what do they say? To a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and we need to avoid that sort of risk that we sort of package solutions up because they're the ones we've got, rather than the best ones to solve the problem. Cool. I'm going to move us on now to the next question, which is, what else I think this is sort of following in nicely. What else would you like to get from evaluation, and what difference would that make? And I want to also chuck in one of the questions from the audience, again from Gavin. Thank you for being so prolific, Gavin. Do we have the right sets of indicators for course correction? So yeah, if we want, I think that is very interesting. Many indicators, we get lots of indicators about tons of carbon, or people with access to electricity, or whatever, those types of things. Do we have those for course correction? And I would add to that, do we have those in time for course correction? So yeah, back to question 2. Can I start this one with Richa? So Richa, what else would you like to get from evaluation, and what difference would that make to your work?
So I mentioned the leapfrog concept, which is that these off-grid populations and weak grid populations, majority of them will be buying their off-grid appliance and energy access technologies for the very first time. So we, as energy access stakeholders, have a very important responsibility to ensure that the most right kind of technologies get deployed and most responsibly. So we should constantly be borrowing from West and especially Europe, because just the ethos on sustainability and equality are very high in this region. So there are a lot of, there's a lot of big conversation on accessible product design and inclusive product design and circularity, which is very important. And so constantly, it's very important to keep investigating what are the most environmentally sustainable business models, the more equitable business models, the more equitable and sustainable technologies, and try and address that. For example, one of the research projects that we just finished was on the use of HFC gases in off-grid refrigerators. And some of you will be familiar with Kigali Amendment, which phases out use of HFC gases. And what is happening in the off-grid world is because the ownership of refrigerators is so low, and so most of the programs that are focused on phasing out HFC gases are geared towards on-grid environments or developed country or urban contexts. And so, if we as energy access stakeholders don't notice that and don't do our bit, then the energy access sector will get neglected. For instance, as part of this research, I realized that 50% of currently deployed refrigerators that we could investigate are still using HFC gases, while in Europe, 100% of refrigerators are natural refrigerant based. And so, only if we do research and reveal these types of blind spots can we make sure that energy access work also happens responsibly.
So thinking bigger, thinking not just about
Yeah,
energy.
very important to join the dots between global north and global south.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, thank you. Jeremy, hand over to you on that question.
Okay, in terms of what I'd like to see evaluation, and I come at this from starting to be aware of just how big the challenge of energy access, and particularly the challenges that energy access enables us to start to deal with in terms of food security, health security, and social well-being and that sort of thing. The scale of the challenge is just so enormous that we cannot rely on individual programs ploughing their own furrow all the time, and I think we really must have a lot more synergies and collaboration between programs. And from the point of view of evaluation, I would imagine this is kind of a bit of a nightmare scenario for evaluators that perhaps are looking at work that's going on in emerging economies, and where programs can, if they choose to, operate very much in isolation, in silos, because they may be in areas that no other program is actually yet active in. And this is perhaps an ideal situation for an evaluator. They've got a relatively pure situation, a disconnected situation, and they can really look and get some really good insight as to what this particular program is achieving on the ground. And I would say that is absolutely not the situation you want to be operating in when you've got a challenge of this scale. We need to have programs standing on the shoulders of other programs in every possible way we can. And we're pushing, I would like to see this going in a direction that gets harder for the evaluator. And anecdotally, I hear how colleagues who've worked in certain emerging economies find that after working 3 years in an economy, they hear that some other program is starting to do exactly what they did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, picking up again, fresh approach to the same problem without really building on others. And I think this comes down to funding, funders wanting to be absolutely clear attribution to their efforts to achieve those outcomes. And okay, the question is, how does evaluation grapple with this? And I'd say it's grappled with it very successfully in Europe, where you have this mess of interaction. Let's just make sure the same lessons are drawn across to SDG7, and the collaborative effort is somehow recognized and credit is given for the programs that choose to work with other programs and build on those results. But yeah, I appreciate it's hard for an evaluator in that situation. That's one of the things I'd like to see.
Yeah, interesting challenge. Thank you, Jeremy. Brian, let's bring you in.
Yeah, that's certainly a very big challenge, what Jeremy's talking about. I was thinking about it a little bit slightly more narrow in that it could, in my mind, I'm thinking about it as an integrated evaluation. And, certainly if it's able to be done across, breaking down the silos and partnerships and all of that, I think that's definitely most effective for the funders. But in terms of the evaluation side, when I think about energy evaluation specifically, oftentimes there's silos between supply side evaluation and demand side evaluation. I think an integrated evaluation for energy would mean that you're looking at the services, as Jeremy mentioned at the start, and making sure that you're actually doing demand side analysis that supports supply side. In other words, as Richa was saying, if we're going to be connecting up homes, and the question is, do they need 500 watts? Do they need a megawatt? Well, you won't know unless you're actually evaluating other homes in the region, doing analysis on what the needs are, and actually doing a needs-driven evaluation. And we do this with our Cooling for All program. We've created a methodology for evaluators, policymakers to look at the needs for cooling? How are we going to actually have access to cooling globally? And we break it down into, you know, human comfort, food, nutrition, health, and medicines. And by using you know, that type of evaluation approach, we can understand, you know, where cooling is needed, use that to then identify which solutions are going to be most effective, and then match the energy needs to achieve those services. And it's not always active energy that's needed. It may be passive energy solutions are needed, whether that's passive lighting, passive natural ventilation, or passive cooling. These are all services that can be delivered, supporting access to those services, while also supporting lower investment needs on the energy access side, that hopefully then enables renewable energy to be used, and doing it in an efficient way, and then all of a sudden you're achieving SDG7 as a whole. So for me, what I like to see from evaluation is this integrated evaluation. When somebody comes to you and says, you know, can you evaluate our demand side program? They say, well, let's look at the supply side as well. Or somebody says, let's look at our supply side program. Say, well, let's look at the demand side as well. And I think that is really critical. And from that, on the question about indicators, you know, there are so many indicators out there. In my mind, I keep breaking it down to indicators and key progress indicators. In our program alone, we have 10 KPIs and about 30 to 40 indicators that we track. So I think we've got enough indicators. It's maybe more about boiling it down to what the most important ones are that help define our activities, to deliver our outcomes, you know, to achieve our goals. So back over to you, Charles.
I think that is just bringing back to that indicators question, because, you know, Richa's talked about equity and about sustainability, and the traditional indicators that you might look at for an energy program aren't speaking to those. Jeremy's talked about standing on the shoulders of other programs, and yeah, there's that that tension between capturing the attribution for your program and sort of recognizing the sort of interdependence and complexity of what's going on. And then, Brian, you've talked about integrated evaluation, and then Gavin in his question mentioned the indicators for course correction. There's also an interesting comment in the discussion forum about indoor home pollution being a massive cause of death in under fives in the developing world, and so those types of really sort of massive problems are not necessarily getting captured by the indicators. What do we do about that? How can we change that? Who's got the ambition for that hard question?
Yeah, no, I think that's hard. That's a big question, of course, and certainly identifying the benefits of a solution. You know, that in its own right is still siloed, but by looking at you know, what the needs are, by looking at the solutions, identifying the benefits of those solutions, and not just a narrow focus of those benefits, but actually looking at how it supports achieving all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And certainly our clean cooking work and our access to cooling work is not just about a single SDG. It's certainly not just about SDG7. It's really about you know, better livelihoods, poverty alleviation, better learning in school, you know, health and nutrition. I mean, it's across the board. So, you know, again, whether it's, you know, it's a big world, and you know, we have this, whether it's integrated evaluation or standing on the shoulders of the other programs, there's certainly a bigger ask of the evaluators to connect the dots. Let others jump in from there.
I wonder if perhaps, okay, I'm coming at this, I'm not an evaluator, right? I don't have that way of thinking, so please forgive me if I'm stating the obvious or off beat here, but I just wonder if, in the same way that your ship's captain does his course corrections based on a wide range of constant information, do we need to think about evaluation as being an integral part of the program? Okay, compartmentalized, maybe disconnected from the management, you know, having that distance from the management, but as being a series of instruments trying to monitor different aspects of the program's activity and impact. And perhaps, I don't know if this is just only in my mind, but I tend to think of an evaluation as a single significant activity that happens at one point of the program's life, and then you have a process of evaluating this big report and think about what you do next. But should we not have evaluators embedded in the programs? And they're not going to be broad evaluators looking at everything. They're going to be specialists in certain social impacts, technological impacts, you know, R&D benefits, funding, financing. Lots of different aspects are increasingly important here, and circularity impacts. Should evaluation actually be lots of bits that are actually built into the program? I know, Brian, this is something maybe you can think about. Richa, can you react to this? Is this mad?
Yeah, I think that certainly agree with both the speakers. I think there's too much burden on the bird evaluation, and many types of research projects can bring to light different types of impacts, and it doesn't need to be a hardcore or a pure impact evaluation to do so. So from a program point of view, you obviously you tend to build a theory of change and implement some KPIs and build an M&E framework around it. And in that sense, once you have built a theory of change, there may be less flexibility to change it for at least some time period until the first course of program runs out. But if you have, if under your program you have the ability to do certain research projects, you can continue to leverage them to continually inform types of different impacts. To give you an example, one of the research we conducted was a cost modeling research to understand the different factors that contribute to the final landed cost of an off-grid refrigerator in Africa. And we realized that more than components or power system costs, the biggest cost is coming from import duties and taxes because they're getting imported from China. And so that is a huge affordability related impact. I mean, it is not an impact evaluation, it's a cost modeling exercise, but we understood the impact of these taxes. And so now we have identified that, okay, we need to create an intervention around this. So another research project that now we're working on is to understand the impact of locally assembling or manufacturing some of these off-grid technologies in Africa, and then try and understand by how much the affordability impact can come about by shifting some of those supply chains. And another co-benefit of this will also be a resiliency to global supply chains in the face of shocks such as pandemics. This is just one example, but there are many examples like this.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, to chip in my view on this, I think evaluation is less about an event and more about a way of thinking. And it's about, you know, drawing on evidence in a sort of independent, objective way to think about how you can do things better. So it doesn't need to be a sort of big bang event at a particular stage. And you know, some of the most successful programs I've seen actually have evaluators embedded within them, and yeah, this constant use of evidence and thinking, both for course correction and for outward communication and so on. So
yeah, and I'm seeing that more and more with the funders. They're actually asking for evaluation and the theory of change and the KPIs, and this sort of constant evaluation to be happening with our programs. And in fact, we've found that in some cases, the funders are not actually funding the big evaluation at the end of the program or midway through the program. And in fact, they prefer to fund sort of this constant evaluation more than the big evaluation at the end. That's what I've been seeing recently.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's an interesting question from Jamelia, which I'm going to kind of summarize because it was quite long, not as long as the question from Raquel I've just seen, but anyway, I'm just going to summarize Jamelia's question, which seems to me about what can we learn from the sort of grid-connected world to help with evaluation in the energy access world, and vice versa. What can people in the grid-connected world learn from the energy access thinking? And obviously SDG7 applies across both. It's not it isn't just something for emerging economies. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think when you think about it that way, you think about the off-grid world and you think about the on-grid world, you're actually thinking supply-side thinking. And I think that's what I would like the off-grid world not to be replicating from the on-grid side. I mean, the on-grid side, I've worked on many utility energy efficiency programs throughout my career, and some utilities really get the benefit of demand-side management and investing in efficiency. But some, if they're not regulated to do so, they would rather not think about it. And so I would love to see the off-grid think about what's actually going to make them achieve their success, which is, getting the services to people that, don't currently have access to modern energy. And that is, in this sort of integrated thinking, this is a combination of passive solutions, efficiency, and renewables. It's a series of these that deliver that service, and not just thinking about just the renewable energy and the solar home. Solar home is great, but it is not a standalone solution. You can't have a house full of inefficient technologies in it and actually achieve the services that is going to bring us better lives. You actually need to have a sufficient, efficient, sustainable home to then operate a solar home system.
Yeah,
I
Richa,
feel
yes.
that in the off-grid world, I feel quite optimistic about the challenge that Brian was highlighting, because of modern data approaches, especially with remote sensing and satellite imagery, some of that gaps have started to diminish, because you can often use a lot of satellite images as proxies to many variables that are hard to measure directly. And it's a great predictive modeling tool as well. For instance, predicting on the demand side what is the probability that a certain household will be demanding this much of consumptive load or that much of consumptive load. Similarly, trying to understand from images of what are densely populated clusters, what are meagerly populated clusters, and directing energy access efforts that way. For instance, in the dense regions, you might want to deploy mini grids. In the more sparsely populated regions, you might want to deploy individual solar home systems. So like that, there are many examples. And in fact, SE4All recently did a webinar on bridging the demand supply energy gap using some of these modern data techniques. So there is a lot of these boutique data consulting firms that use a lot of AI and GIS that are mushrooming to address just this gap in the off-grid context.
So there is cross-learning between the two. Yeah, Jeremy, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, having kind of bridged those two areas myself, in terms of having come from appliance policy development for most of my career, and now sort of landed in off-grid SDG7 type challenges. I'm actually quite wary of transferring too much of the baggage of conventional appliance policy. we are talking about a very different situation compared to Europe, US, Australia, Japan, etc., China, in terms of the social setting, the absence of a competitive market for these appliances. I mean, the whole idea of bringing in mandatory efficiency performance standards to a very fragile, very formative market is quite scary to the SMEs, and they are almost exclusively SMEs making this equipment. The whole idea of them bringing in MEPs is, a bit scary, really, and probably inappropriate. And the whole social setting, the situation is so different to Europe and US. I'd be quite wary of bringing too much across. I'm not saying that there's nothing that could be learned, absolutely. I mean, it needs to be thought through. But I think the situation demands some fresh thinking. And particularly, I see this developing economy, emerging economy situation as an excellent ground on which to develop circular economy thinking, because the situation is so much more positive towards that anyway. You've got the scarcity of the equipment, which needs to be used, reused, repurposed, etc. You've got much lower labor costs. You've got demand far exceeding supply of the equipment and the services. And I think that whole situation, and you've also got the absence of a waste infrastructure, which means it's all the more important to look at circularity. And the social implications of circular economy thinking are so much more urgent and important for these economies. So I think that's a big difference with many of the established appliance economies that could be very positively exploited. I think, some new thinking needs to be brought into that to really push that.
Thank you. Yeah,
bring lessons back to these other economies that are already ossified in this way of thinking, this extraction thinking, and replace anything that shows any sign of wear and tear.
Interesting. No, that's a really, really interesting point. I'm going to bring in another question now from Raquel de Luis Iglesias, who raises an interesting question about how consultants are able or are best able to support this evaluation process. Because the point she makes is that to do evaluation the way you're talking about requires a really deep knowledge of context, an understanding of sort of the programs, what they're trying to deliver, the context they're working in. And consultants who are working across a wide range of areas might find that quite challenging to be able to add value in that area. So she's asking if there are any tools or methods you'd like to see more of, like context reviews, benchmarking with other programs, or should it be addressed with closer collaboration, or putting more time into the scoping, or actually should you be choosing consultants who actually have that deep understanding and can add some value in that area? Any thoughts on that?
My experience has been, and I've worked on both sides of the table. So I've worked in various roles as a pure researcher in a university, delivering on the projects from investors myself, and I've also served as on the program management side, where I create research questions and develop scope of work and then hire consultants to deliver them. And my experience is that there is a role for both of a pure evaluator who understands the methods very deeply, and the role of an energy access expert who understands who probably has a more shallow understanding, but a more kind of like a bird's eye view of the different types of methods that get deployed, to be able to determine what the right kind of method ought to be to speak to that research question or scope of work. And so the project manager or the person who develops the scope of work, who may not be the actual evaluator, has an equally important role to do that upfront task. And once and often in these cases where you want to leverage the skill set of a consultant who is an expert on a certain method, but maybe not an energy access expert, it works really well if you have a project manager who has a deep context of the research question and guide, you get those efforts, because it's hard to find all the required skill sets in a single person, and that's a very unreasonable ask.
Jeremy.
It's too much to expect a single person or organization even to cover all of these aspects. And I think we should be looking to appoint a range of people. And I was so encouraged by what Brian said about embedded evaluation and sort of multiple evaluations almost going on at the same time, and thinking about that from different sources as you go along. I think you have to take advice from as wide a as you possibly can, really. So I would try and avoid that question of, is there somebody who could do it all? No, I'm pretty sure there isn't. And just accept that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we see value in bringing in a pure evaluator to bring in that critical thinking, somebody that is going to have that third-party perspective, and bringing in different methods than our own internal team would have, or our content experts would have. And so I do think, like Richa said, it's going to be a combination, but there are times when you're going to want to have content experts that are thinking more like evaluators, and you're going to want to have evaluators that are able to at least communicate with the content experts. And in the case where they actually have an expertise, which I think is, with all of the different topics on SDG7, there's nobody that knows every one of the SDG7 topics. So, just having related experience, I think, is probably the minimum you're going to expect on most of your evaluation projects. So bringing in that similar experience and then delivering with content experts that are either already on the team or somebody that can be brought onto the team, I think is the way to go.
Yeah.
There's a subject that Richa mentioned in a previous discussion, I think, and Charles, you picked up on this. So this need to be vigilant for unintended consequences. And I think was something that Richa pointed out a while ago, and before this session today. And I think that is so important when you're trying to set up a brand new market in a new economy, in a new part of the world that hasn't perhaps benefited from some of this equipment and technology yet. Being aware of the social impacts of what's being deployed is so important, and having people that are looking at the social impacts and the societal impacts and the waste, as well as the waste and energy impacts, and not just looking at the benefits either, looking for the fact that local ways of producing food and making a living are being destroyed by bringing new technologies that are making things that weren't previously possible almost inevitable, because people will want it because it's different, and it may not be what's going to actually be sustainable for that community. I had quite a real eye opener by a social scientist tagged on to the end of a cooling conference I was at a couple of years ago, just pointing out the way presence of air conditioning and cooling technologies has transformed life in Southeast Asia. Social fabrics just really turned on their heads in terms of working hours and family time and types of food, types of clothes, lots of impacts that perhaps were not really thought through. And evaluation can help open eyes to these things.
Fascinating. I'm going to move us on because it's been fascinating and great debate, but we've only got 5 minutes and 39 seconds left. And I do want us to kind of tie it together, which I think our third question does. Let's have some key takeaways. What can we do better? What should funders and evaluators do? And what could energy evaluation as a community do to support better evaluation in this field? So a minute and a half maximum each. So really top of the head. And Jeremy, I'm going to get you to go first.
Things that have made me encouraged from what we've been talking about today. I think this whole idea of embedded evaluation is going to be very, very important to getting fast feedback and the type of course correction thinking that Charles, you picked up on early on. And I would say evaluators, in the same way that we're trying to get programs to work together more cooperatively and build on the work of others, I think the evaluator team should also be thinking in these same ways and thinking, right, well, how do we bring in the social scientists, the circular economy people, making their own collaborations of evaluators that can have the tools that are needed by the evaluator, but bring together these many diverse views and knowledge and experience and insights that we can't expect to be present in a single organization. What can evaluators do in terms of assembling more diverse teams that can respond to this?
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to cut you off and move across to Brian to make sure everyone gets a say.
Okay, great. So from my perspective, I mean, obviously the funders need to be asking for this. They need to be asking for the KPIs. They need to be asking for the theory of change. That needs to be built into the team. That gets the teams thinking differently, whether that's a policymaker, a program operator, a project team. As if the team is starting to think with an evaluation mentality, I think that's a really big step forward. Charles, the work that you've been doing with the IEA in terms of training people on evaluation, I think more of that is needed. More of that's needed to actually train this evaluation thought process and these methods to more policymakers, more program implementers, to the funders as well. I think there's a huge role in evaluators sharing their expertise, and then the actual evaluators themselves making sure that they're able to support key course corrections and being able to work with organizations like SE4All to actually do a real full evaluation in addition to the in-project work that we are trying to incorporate now as well.
Brilliant suggestions. Thank you, Brian. Richa, I hope there's some left for you.
Yeah, I just like to reiterate that it is very important to continuously uncover blind spots in impact areas. And this is often a catch-22 situation, because unless you have funding, you cannot get data or do research to uncover those blind spots. And unless you have data on blind spots, it's hard to attract funding toward it. But some of the projects that we've been doing, we've been able to do very quick desk-based research projects to quickly demonstrate that the impact of certain interventions that has then attracted funding to larger efforts. For example, repairability of appliances. For example, why people with disabilities matter in the leave no one behind agenda in the energy access debate. I mean, just from literature review and speaking with stakeholders who are focused on that, for example, disability stakeholders, you can discover a lot. And when you make those data visible, then that rhetoric becomes stronger.
Marvelous. Yes. Gosh, I've taken so much away from this session. It's been really fascinating. Thank you so much, everybody. A couple of things that just occurred to me as you were talking. One is there's a lot of really good work that's been done on multiple benefits, particularly the IEA's work, and there's been work done across Horizon 2020 on that COMBI project and so on. So there's a lot of interesting work there that might help to tie things together in places. I love this. I'm getting this sense of evaluation as a sort of center that brings together the sort of the multidisciplinary approaches, the embedded within an organization. I see that working really well. Anyway, thank you all so much for your time. Thank you to the questioners. Thank you to the attendees. It's been a great session. It will be available to review again, and it's one of the few we're going to publish straight away, so you can share with your friends if you want to, and see you in the next session. Thank you very much for coming.